Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK. I'm Darren Grimes and I thank you very much for your company. The number of people in England waiting to start routine hospital treatment has risen to the highest level since records began 15 years ago. With accident and emergency and ambulance waits soaring, with absent staff shortages, increased demand, all of these things are being blamed for the NHS's problems. But do they actually predate the pandemic? NHS data shows that 6.2 million people are waiting to start treatment. That's the highest number, as I say, since records began in August of 2007. Now, can this actually all be blamed on that lockdown? Ministers have promised to actually eliminate all waits of more than 2 years by July of this year. Can that possibly be achieved? How do others around the globe who also experienced the pandemic and adopted the lockdown strategy actually compare to our own? Well, joining me to discuss all of these things is Dr. Kristian Niemietz from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hi, Kristian.
Hello, Darren.
Kristian, how have we got here? Do you actually blame all of this? Do you say all of this is the fault of the pandemic, right? We wouldn't be experiencing these problems within the National Health Service had it not been for the pandemic.
Well, the pandemic has certainly made things more extreme. There's no doubt about that. And that's not very surprising. That's what we would have expected. But it is an issue that, even if not in that magnitude, long predates the pandemic. I mean, waiting times have always been an issue on the NHS. You can see this if you look at old newspaper articles on healthcare from 20, 30, 40 years ago. That was always an issue and it never went away. And if we look at actual figures, the NHS has always had longer waiting times than a lot of comparable systems. And now, even if we compare things during the pandemic, I've had a look recently at Dutch waiting figures during 2020. So first year of the pandemic, first wave, and most of the second wave would be captured by that. And even though their waiting times also went up during the pandemic for obvious reasons, nonetheless, their 2020 waiting times figures were still better than ours are in a good year. That's quite a contrast. So,
Yeah, so what
there's more.
explains that then? What is the difference between the two systems?
Well, theirs is a broadly market-driven system. It's a private insurance system where everyone is privately insured. All hospital providers, all healthcare providers generally are private companies, usually non-profit, but private and in competition with one another. It's a regulated system. It's not a completely free market system. Don't think any healthcare system is. The state plays a role, especially in ensuring that it is a universal system, that to make sure that everyone can afford their premiums, and to make sure that health insurers cannot discriminate. But it is a competitive system. It's a market-driven system, and that does make a difference. We see this. It's not just the NHS which has this problem. This seems to be a general problem in state-run healthcare systems. Also true in some of the Mediterranean countries, Spain, Italy, that have tax-funded, state-run healthcare systems. And we don't see that in more decentralized, more market-based systems, such as the Dutch, German, Swiss, Israeli one.
And I guess the caricature, Kristian, would be very much that any market involvement within a healthcare system would lead to people being left on the sidelines. If you're not able to pay for your healthcare, that you wouldn't receive access to it. That caricature couldn't be further from the truth, right? These systems, as you say, universal access is very much at the heart of them.
Yes, exactly. And they've had that for about as long as Britain had it. That's universality is actually pretty easy to achieve if the political will is there. The only thing you need is a system of premium support, so that let's say you are on a very low income, you can't afford the health insurance premium. You would then just get a top up, and that top up, that premium subsidy can be up to 100% of the health insurance premium if you have no income at all. So that for you, the health insurance would then be free at the point of contracting, and you would be covered. There would be no way in which you could fall through the cracks. And I mean, the figures show that. There's OECD data on that, which shows you the percentage of the population in various countries with guaranteed access to a broad package of healthcare services. And among developed countries, it really is only the US which is the outlier here. They're the only ones who have this issue with the uninsured population. Pretty much across the board elsewhere in other developed countries, even plenty of middle-income countries have universal access. That's not a very special achievement. That's very easy to do. You just need to make sure that if somebody can't pay for the premium, then have some program in place to pay it for them.
And what is the problem then with the state playing a role as big as it does within the National Health Service? Because you mentioned that there are other examples of which too much of state involvement leads to worse healthcare outcomes. But why is that the case? Is it because they are overly centralised? Is it because you are trying to centrally plan everything? So, Whitehall will be the ones making the decisions? Because I thought the way in which the NHS had tried to solve that issue was to basically segregate the NHS into individual trusts which have autonomy and are able to actually make their own decisions. Is that not correct?
That has happened. That was the big reform in the Blair years, that they wanted to move away from this monolithic system and bring a bit of an element of market competition into the system. So they gave the NHS trusts, the individual units within the NHS, some greater operational autonomy, and also changed the payment system in such a way that those NHS trusts that attract more patients would also make more money. So they get paid partly on the basis of activity. And that is an arrangement which simulates a market a little bit. It's a market simulation. It's not like an actual market where you have free entry and exit, and you can have takeovers very easily and things of that kind. It's more of a market light, but there is some market element, and that was an improvement. The post-Blair NHS is clearly better than the pre-Blair NHS was. One of the problems is that they haven't applied that principle across the board. So even though you now have greater patient choice and you have this payment formula that I've mentioned where NHS trusts can increase their revenue by attracting more patients, giving them an incentive to be a bit more consumer focused. What hasn't changed is that we still have a very socialist medical labor market. That means that there's not much variation in pay and working conditions. You would still have national pay scales, and you would have the Department of Health negotiating with the nursing union and with the British Medical Association. We're not treating individual NHS trusts as employers in their own right. Ideally, you should say these are employers, and if you work in healthcare, your employment contract, your employment relation should be with your hospital or your healthcare provider, the one that you work for, not with the NHS as such. So you would then get variation in areas where there's shortfalls in demand. Wages could go up, or they could find some other way of trying to make it more attractive. In places where shortages, staff shortages are less of an issue, you might not get wage increases, and you would get greater differentiation and greater flexibility.
How does that actually work then? You mentioned there the fact that it's very much still a unionised labour force, right? There will be that people threaten to strike and all of these other things to try and boost their pay packets. How does a doctor, for example, how does the NHS, the Department for Health, actually say, right, this is how much a doctor is worth without that market involvement. Because other countries around the world, Kristian, I'm interested in how we actually compare globally and whether or not you think that's why we struggle to get people to come and work in the NHS. At the minute, for example, one of the reasons the NHS cites for the accident and emergency wait time increase is a lack of doctors, right? You've got fewer doctors, and that means there are fewer people able to actually deal with patients at the door of an NHS trust. Do you think actually this centralized system, the fact that we have this state determination of how much a doctor is worth, is that why people are shunning the NHS and saying, I'm going to go work elsewhere?
Yes, that must be part of the issue. It is quite extraordinary that we have these persistent doctor and nursing shortages because, I mean, the British system has one massive advantage compared to many other healthcare systems, which is that overseas recruitment is relatively easy. Most doctors, wherever they're trained in the world, speak English. That is in itself a massive competitive advantage. That's an advantage which, say, the Finnish healthcare system doesn't have. They couldn't go to India and hope that they will find people who will be fluent in Finnish, or the Hungarian system is not an asset which they have. And the fact that they've still created shortages despite having that massive edge over competing systems, that is quite telling. There clearly are shortages. We have fewer doctors and nurses and specialists per capita than most other systems. And it can't just be because of the overall amount of money going into the system not being enough, because healthcare spending in Britain is fairly average. I mean, before the pandemic, now it's actually increased further, but even in 2019, before the pandemic, healthcare spending was a bit above OECD average, but above the EU average. It's you can find systems that spend more, but there's nothing particularly special about the British figures in that regard. Healthcare spending is comparable to other systems or higher, but somehow we don't manage to convert those spending figures into staff numbers. And part of the problem there really has to be the lack of flexibility that I mentioned, so that you have national pay scales rather than individualized bargaining between each NHS employer and their staff. And there's the issue of central planning in medical training. So in our system, the government tries to plan how many doctors we're going to need in 10 years' time or whenever. And that kind of central planning is just prone to failure. There you have a guarantee that isn't going to work. I would just abolish that kind of rationing and central planning completely. I would have, at the moment, what they're trying to do is they limit medical places, at universities, how many people can sign up for a medical degree. That is capped. I would have no cap there whatsoever. I would simply tell people honestly, yes, you can sign up for a medical degree. There will just be no guarantee that you will actually be able to work as a doctor. But that's a risk that everyone else, whatever career choice they're making, also has. And therefore, I would just get rid of any kind of plan there and let people study what they want. And if some people then can't find a job as a doctor, then they'll have to do something else, work in the pharmaceutical industry or whatever.
I imagine most people would agree with that sentiment, because I imagine most people would quite like there to be more doctors, right? That's one thing that you hear more than anything else. The NHS always tops the public concerns, really, as far as pollsters are concerned. But I'm wondering, Kristian, in what other developed economy would you receive a text message? Your colleague Christopher Snowdon tweeted about this, in which he'd received a text message from his GP surgery, basically telling him, and I paraphrase slightly, to not make an appointment or to bother trying to see them at a certain, I think it was the bank holiday weekend.
Yes.
In what other system, Christian, would it be accepted by a nation that rationing of that kind is okay, is permissible?
Yes, that is really quite stark. You would think normally, if we had an even vaguely market-oriented system, the healthcare providers would of course want you to come, because that is how they make money, and this would be. You wouldn't expect restaurants to send you a text message saying, "Please don't come here. We don't want you. Leave us alone." Um, and even though we already had those Blair reforms that I mentioned, there is now some incentive for healthcare providers to try to attract people, uh, it hasn't. It still doesn't have the momentum to really change incentives in such a way that if you can't attract consumers and if they don't want to come back, if they're not happy, that you can also have bankruptcies in the system, that you might also just have providers having to shut down if they're not successful in attracting people. So that competitive element clearly still hasn't taken hold in the system. Um, I'd say it's not exclusively an NHS problem. It's not that there's no other developed country which has problems like that, but where we see similar outcomes, it would be in places that have a somewhat similar system. So I mentioned Spain, Italy. They also have not national health services, but regional ones, but still state-run health systems. And in that kind of system, that sort of rationing is just what you get. That is just a feature of the system. It lacks that consumer orientation.
What would you say then to people, and there will be people perhaps listening to us right now who say, well, I was very uneasy. One thing I always see touted about is Virgin, Richard Branson's interest in healthcare, as if Richard Branson himself, dedicated every living moment of his life to taking over the NHS. But you have people with genuine concerns, Christian, that the marketisation of healthcare would lead to, as you say, potential bankruptcies of healthcare providers, and these because of the competition element, and therefore there would be people that end up without a doctor, without access to a doctor, or without access to nurses, or without access to operations, and all of these things. How would you allay those concerns? Is this happening in countries like Israel or Germany? Are there people that, may get a letter saying, right, come in next month for your operation, your hip operation, for example, only to find out that their healthcare provider has gone bankrupt?
No, it would work more like when, say, your energy provider or goes bust. They would just be taken over by a different one, and you would get a letter from the new company saying you are now registered with us, and if you're happy with that, do nothing. Things stay as they are. If you're not happy with it, you have the option of switching, but it wouldn't mean that there is suddenly that you try to switch on the light one morning and nothing happens. And in competitive systems, that is how it works in the healthcare sector as well, that you get takeovers. But that's something that happens behind the scenes. You don't have to notice that as a patient. It would just be there would be a different logo on the hospital roof, and it would be run by a different organization. But it doesn't mean that it disappears and is razed to the ground. It would just be something that happens behind the scenes. Um, they get taken over by a different one, and but you still have you can still make sure that that is that doesn't have to be disruptive to the individual patient. And certainly in the insurance sector, that is even more common.
Mm-hmm.
There used to be, specifically in the German system, that's something that I remember, because historically people didn't have free choice of health insurers. That used to be tied to mostly employer or sector where you worked, or region. And in the olden days, it wasn't a very competitive system. And then in, I think, the early 90s or so, they introduced free choice of health insurer, what happened then was that there was a massive market consolidation, that some of the popular insurers just got a lot more clients and some of the smaller ones couldn't compete anymore. But that didn't mean that some people were suddenly without insurance. It just meant they got taken over and got a letter of the sort that, as I mentioned in the case of the energy company, or in the banking sector, that also happens. You can get a letter. Your bank has been taken over. You are now with a different company. If you're happy with the way things are, don't worry, do nothing. Things can just carry on for you.
I guess that analogy works a lot better before the price cap, right? Where the government has basically just killed off
Yes,
competition.
admittedly,
But
yes.
yeah, the one another line that we hear quite often is one about the way in which it would create a two-tier healthcare service, right? But Christian, my understanding of the healthcare system right now, the NHS that is that we've already created a two-tier system. How many times have you heard over, and admittedly that's anecdotally, but I dare say there would be data that backs this up, where people have said, oh, well, I couldn't get an NHS appointment for my mental health, so I've gone private. I couldn't get my mother an operation in time for a hip replacement, so I've gone private. Or I couldn't get this dentistry. It could be a whole host of things where in this country people have gone to the private sector instead. Isn't there already a de facto two-tier system where people who can't pay don't, and people who can pay do?
Yes, that's exactly the problem. And that clearly intensified during the pandemic with people on waiting lists. Some of them eventually gave up in frustration and said, this isn't going anywhere, I'm going private. But then, of course, since we have had this monopolized healthcare system the whole time, or for such a long time, what that means is that the private healthcare sector, such as it is very much an upmarket sector. It's tailored to wealthy people. And that is just what you get when you have a state provider that covers the basic services and that just crowds out low-cost provision. It's for the same reason that, imagine we had a national pub service, something where 90% of pubs are run by the state. Now, you might still get some luxury pubs because the state-run pub, the National Pub Service, probably wouldn't offer very exclusive types of fine wines or whatever. So there might still be that gap in the market. That there would be some private pubs trying to cater to millionaires who want to spend loads of money on a fine vintage Bordeaux wine. But you would never have had the likes of Weatherspoons in such a system because they just wouldn't be able to compete with a free at the point of use provider. And that's more or less what happened in healthcare, that if you have a state monopoly that offers something for free, even if it's not at a fantastic quality, then that means private provision, to the extent that it still exists, will be in the luxury segment. You will not get low-cost providers. And that is why in Britain, that is one of the oddities that here we associate private healthcare with luxury. If somebody tells you, I've got a job offer and they offer private healthcare, that would be a way of saying this is a big bonus.
Exactly.
Whereas in more mixed systems, you wouldn't necessarily have that association. Private doesn't have to mean luxury or expensive. Private just means well, you're just describing the nature of the ownership of the institution, but it doesn't have to have that connotation with being upmarket and expensive, and it doesn't have to be. We've created those incentives in the system we have, and that is why we now have that problem that lots of people can't get regular healthcare on the NHS. So they look for alternatives, but the only place they have to go is that private healthcare sector, which is unfortunately pretty much exclusively a luxury sector. We don't have low-cost private provision. We would have in a different system.
What do you think then you would say to people that are deeply concerned about the Americanisation of the NHS? Because one, as you are well aware, Kristian, the opposition parties, opposition to the Conservative Party, very much trumpeted being a I didn't deliberately say that, but of course the charge was that they were going to sell the NHS to Donald Trump during a American trade deal between the UK and the USA. But why is that parroted by opposition parties? Is it because it's genuinely a concern of the British public? Do you really think that the British people are out there absolutely terrified beyond belief about the idea of the NHS ending up in the hands of American healthcare providers, and therefore we end up with the problems of American healthcare providers, which you yourself, Kristian, admit are great, and that the American model is not at all remotely ideal?
Yes, it is a widespread concern. There was at the time, at the peak of this hysteria about Donald Trump taking over the NHS, there was a survey on this, and I can't remember the exact figures, but there were quite a lot of people who either said, yes, I believe that that is a danger, or who said, at least it's a possibility. It was never either of those things. A trade deal, of course, has nothing to do with how you run your healthcare system. You can have a trade deal with all sorts of countries. Doesn't mean that you have to have the same healthcare system that they have. No, I would simply say that the US system and the problems that they have is pretty much a unique system. And we don't see similar problems in other, including in private and market-based healthcare systems. So they are pretty much the only ones who have those problems. By those problems, I mean very high costs. They spend something like 18% of GDP on healthcare. They have the uninsured population that I mentioned, and even their outcomes are not that fantastic, or at least not across the board. And so that clearly isn't a system that you would want to go for. But it's also a system that is so unusual and that nobody is proposing anyway, that I think it's a disingenuous argument to say marketization has to mean Americanization. And opponents of private provision, opponents of market mechanisms do that quite deliberately, that they always refer to this scarecrow example, because it's just rhetorically an easy case to make.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have the same ring to it if you said, oh God, imagine marketization. We could be like the Netherlands. Wouldn't that be terrible? Because then most people would think, that doesn't sound particularly scary. That doesn't sound so bad to me. What's the problem with that? So therefore, it's quite deliberate, this conflation of marketization with Americanization. But there's just no reason to assume that a market-based system would look anything like the US system if we tried marketization here.
Do you think the solution to all of the problems that we've raised and spoken about over the past half an hour or so, do you think that ultimately the problem is that the NHS is the ultimate political football, right? It's kicked from party to party. It's used in every sales pitch of why you should vote for this party or that party. And actually, were there to be some form of, which I know there have been time and again, haven't there, grand commission that was independent of politics, that could conclude what model for the NHS was the best route forward, that would deal with everything from health and social care to, I don't know, a whole host of issues, that diversifies the system and allows people to choose from different providers that are tailored more to their needs and concerns. Am I being Panglossian here? Am I being utopian? Is this totally mad? Or is there a way in which you can detach the NHS from party politics?
As long as you have a national health service, I think it will always be political. We could imagine all sorts of models. We could imagine the NHS or NHS England being a bit like the central bank, a bit like the Bank of England, which is so at least supposed to be independent of politics. I suppose one could imagine a healthcare system which is like that too. It's just that in practice, I can't see how that would be feasible because NHS spending is something like 8% of GDP. It's the single biggest component of public spending. And there is just no way you're going to take that out of the political process altogether. As long as you have such a big proportion of the tax budget spent on healthcare. Healthcare is going to be a major concern, and people will, for rightly or wrongly, hold the current government to account for what's going on in healthcare, and therefore there have been various attempts over the years to take the day-to-day management of the NHS away from politics. It's just that when something goes wrong, then voters will still blame the health secretary, still blame the government, and therefore it's sort of understandable that these people then will want to have some control over how the system operates, because they will say, well, I have to take the blame anyway, so you can't convince me that I should have no power over this. It wouldn't be realistic for a health secretary or any member of the cabinet to say when there's a problem in the health sector, they wouldn't say, "Oh, that's got nothing to do with me. It's independent, so don't bother me. Leave me alone." That would just that would be quite hard to do politically. So for that reason alone, I think it will always be a politicized system, and there's a bit of a conflict here that if you ask people, if you did a survey saying, would you prefer a more marketized system? I'm guessing well over 90% would say, oh God, no, that would be absolute horror. But if you ask people, would you like a less political system? Would you want a system in which politicians have less of a say? I think that would be quite popular. It's just that realistically, the only way you can take the politics out of it is to move to a more market-based system, because a system has to be coordinated by something. And if that isn't politics, it has to be market forces.
I wonder then, and I realise I'm at risk of asking you to be a sort of pound shop clairvoyant here, but a mystic Meg, if you will, of the future of the National Health Service or healthcare in Britain. But I wonder what you see as the future, because given that these concerns, as you set out, the waiting lists, the lack of staff, and a whole host of other issues predate the pandemic. What do you see as the future of the NHS? Where is this going to end up? Do you see, Kristian, your arguments becoming more potent and popular in the future thanks to the exacerbation of problems in the healthcare service? All of these problems that we've spoken about becoming far worse, and the public saying, well, hang on, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And they turn to Labour and the Tories, whoever, and just say to them, sort this out. Do you see this becoming the route to reform within the healthcare service, or do you see this as an excuse for politicians to double down and make things 10 times worse ultimately?
Something closer to the latter, I'm afraid. And that is because, yes, if you think about it logically, a lack of satisfaction with the NHS should lead to greater willingness for fundamental reforms. And we do see this. The latest edition of the British Social Attitude Survey showed that there's been a massive increase in the share of people who say they're dissatisfied with the NHS. That was something that just wouldn't have happened a couple of years ago because it was a social taboo. Even if you were in reality unhappy with the NHS, you wouldn't say that in a survey like that. That would be almost an act of disloyalty. So therefore, you always had well over 50%, some up to 70% in some years saying, yes, I'm super happy with the NHS, everything is fantastic. And it was never more than, I think, 30% or so who said, no, I'm not happy with it. And that has now changed. Last year, we had, for the first time in a long time, we had more people saying, I'm not happy with it than people who did say everything's brilliant. So that looks like a bit of a breakthrough. But the trouble is, if you dig a bit deeper, if you look at what it is that people say they are unhappy about, or what they think the solution would be, it still looks like a doubling down. The people who say they are dissatisfied with the NHS don't tend to blame the NHS as such. They would say it's because of a lack of money. That's still one of the most popular response options. Or more generally, they would say it's government reforms of some unspecified nature. So in other words, those respondents are still saying there's nothing wrong with the NHS per se. It's all just somehow what the government does with it, mismanagement, underfunding. And it doesn't lead to a questioning of the NHS as a model. And I could imagine that even if we had a greater tendency to use private healthcare, even that might not undermine the commitment to the NHS in the abstract. You could rather get a situation where, which would be similar to this old story about the old cliche of the Guardian reader who waxes lyrical about the comprehensive school system and sends their own kids to a private school. And you could get very much the equivalent of that in healthcare, that you get people saying, oh no, the NHS, absolutely brilliant, wonderful. I just don't want to use it. I go private. But for the rest of you, it's brilliant. And you could get something like that.
Dr. Kristian Niemietz, we have covered quite a lot. I would basically tell everybody that has watched this and thought, either, even if they disagree with you, Kristian, on some certain topics, to follow you on Twitter, because I think you have one of the best Twitter accounts on that hell site, and you are fantastically creative on there, and people should just get following you immediately if they have an account. But Dr. Kristian Niemietz, you have gone through what you would do as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and indeed what you would do to the National Health Service and the problems that are there with it. I think what I'll do is separate both of these videos into two separate videos so that people can experience them in their full glory. But Dr. Kristian Niemietz, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Now, folks, if you did enjoy that, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on